The space around Proxima Station looked like a graveyard of twisted metal and burning ships. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the EDS Valiant and watched his fleet die around him. The Third Galactic War had been going on for 18 months, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The ambush had been perfect. The Zephyrian hegemony and their Korathi allies had waited in the shadow of the gas giant until the human fleet was committed to the station defense. Now Morrison's ships were surrounded on all sides with no way out. "Sir, we've lost the Manchester and the Detroit," reported Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks from her position at the tactical station. Her voice stayed steady, but Morrison could see the fear in her eyes. "The Phoenix is venting atmosphere, and the Charleston has lost main power." Morrison gripped the railing of the command platform. Around him, his bridge crew worked frantically at their stations. The young ensign at communications kept trying to raise the other ships in the fleet. The weapons officer was calling out target coordinates, even though their main guns were nearly out of ammunition. "How many ships do we have left?" Morrison asked. 14 out of 43, Brooks replied. "And most of those are damaged." The view screen showed the enemy fleet closing in from all directions. The Zephyrian ships were massive things that looked more like floating cities than warships. Their weapons fired streams of blue energy that could cut through human shields, like they were made of paper. The smaller Korathi vessels darted between them like angry wasps, their missile pods launching endless volleys at the human ships. Chief Engineer Danny Carter's voice crackled over the intercom from the engine room. "Commander, we're down to 30% power. The main reactor is overheating and I can't get the backup systems online." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his daughter Amy back on Earth. She was only 12 years old and believed her father was the strongest man in the galaxy. What would she think if she could see him now? "Sir," the communications officer called out, "the enemy is hailing us." "Put them through." The view screen flickered and the image of a Zephyrian commander appeared. The alien was tall and thin with 4 arms and skin that looked like gray leather. Its eyes were black and cold like pieces of obsidian. When it spoke, its voice was translated by the ship's computer into flat, emotionless English. "Human vessel. You are surrounded. Your fleet is destroyed. Surrender now or we will destroy you all." Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These were good people who had followed him into battle, trusting that he would bring them home. Now he was about to make a decision that would change everything. "What are your terms?" Morrison asked. The alien's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile. "You will power down your weapons and surrender your ship. Your crew will be taken prisoner. You and your senior officers will be held for trial." "Trial for what?" "For crimes against the natural order of the galaxy. For daring to resist your betters." Morrison felt anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down. Getting angry would not save his crew. "I need time to consider. You have 5 minutes." The screen went dark. Morrison turned to face his officers. Brooks stood at attention beside her station. Carter had come up from engineering and was wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Tactical Officer Katie Wells was at the weapons console, her fingers still hovering over the firing controls. "Options?" Morrison asked. "We could try to fight our way out," Wells said. "Take as many of them with us as we can." "With what?" Brooks asked. "We're almost out of ammunition and our shields are failing. We could self-destruct," Carter said quietly. "Make sure they don't get anything useful from our ship." Morrison looked at the faces of his crew. The young ensign at communications was barely 19 years old. The navigator was a mother of 2. The weapons officer had just gotten married before the deployment. These were not professional soldiers who had signed up to die. They were ordinary people who had answered their planet's call when it needed them. "Sir," Brooks said softly, "if, we surrender, at least the crew lives." Morrison nodded slowly. He had known this moment might come from the day he accepted command of the Valiant. Every captain in the fleet had been briefed on the possibility of capture. They had been told that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to alien species and That prisoners of war might not be treated according to human standards, but what choice did he have? He could order his ship to fight to the last man and woman, but that would accomplish nothing except getting his crew killed. At least if they surrendered, some of them might survive to see their families again. "Open a channel to the enemy commander," Morrison said. The alien's face appeared on the screen again. "Have you made your decision? We surrender? But I want guarantees that my crew will be treated according to the laws of war." The alien made a sound that might have been laughter. "You are in no position to make demands, human. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded." Morrison turned to his crew. "You heard the order. Stand down all weapon systems. Seal all classified materials. Prepare for boarding." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the life support systems. Morrison could hear the distant sounds of the enemy ships moving closer. Soon there would be alien soldiers on his ship, in his corridors, touching things that belonged to humanity. "Sir," the communications officer said, "the enemy is demanding that you and your senior staff report to the main airlock." Morrison nodded. He had expected this. "Brooks, Carter, Wells, you're with me. The rest of you stay at your stations and cooperate with the boarding party. Remember, you're still members of the Earth Defense Fleet. Act like it." The walk to the airlock felt like the longest journey of Morrison's life. The corridors of the Valiant were filled with his crew, all of them looking at him with expressions of fear and uncertainty. Some of them were very young, barely out of training. Others were veterans who had served with him for years. At the airlock, Morrison could hear the sounds of the enemy ship docking. There was a hiss of equalizing pressure, and then the inner door opened. 4 Zephyrian soldiers entered, their weapons drawn and ready. They were followed by an officer who looked at the humans with obvious disgust. "You are the commander?" the officer asked. "I am. Remove your insignia." "You are no longer officers of anything." Morrison slowly reached up and removed the rank pins from his collar. Brooks, Carter, and Wells did the same. The small pieces of metal that had represented years of service and sacrifice clattered to the deck. "Move," the officer ordered. As they were led away from their ship, Morrison looked back one last time at the Valiant. She had been a good ship and a good home. Now she belonged to the enemy. He wondered if he would ever see her again. The holding cell on the Zephyrian ship was small and dark. Commander Jake Morrison sat on the cold metal floor with his back against the wall. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks was beside him, her uniform torn and dirty. Chief Engineer Danny Carter paced back and forth in the narrow space while Tactical Officer Katie Wells stared at the locked door. They had been prisoners for 3 days now. The food was thin soup that tasted like metal. The water was warm and had a strange smell. The aliens had taken their boots and given them rough cloth shoes that barely fit. Morrison's feet were sore and his back ached from sleeping on the hard floor. "Do you think they'll actually put us on trial?" Brooks asked quietly. Morrison shrugged. "Does it matter? They'll do whatever they want with us." The door opened with a loud clang. 3 Zephyrian guards entered, their weapons ready. Behind them came an officer Morrison had not seen before. This one was shorter than the others, but its eyes were colder. "You are going to trial," the officer said in its flat mechanical voice. "You will be judged for your crimes against the galaxy." "What crimes?" Carter asked. "We were defending our own space." The officer struck Carter across the face with its weapon. The engineer stumbled backward, blood running from his nose. "You will not speak unless asked a question." They were led through the corridors of the enemy ship. Morrison tried to remember the layout, but all the passages looked the same. The walls were made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light. The air smelled of chemicals and something else Morrison could not identify. The ship's bridge was huge compared to human vessels. Dozens of aliens worked at stations that looked more like art than technology. The main view screen showed a planet below them. Morrison recognized it immediately and felt his heart sink. New Denver had been one of humanity's most successful colonies. 2 million people had lived there in cities that gleamed like jewels. Now the planet looked different. The cities were still there, but they were darker. Smoke rose from several areas. The orbital defense platforms that had once protected the world were gone. Beautiful, is it not? The Zephyrian commander said. It was the same alien who had demanded their surrender. Your people built well. We have improved upon their work. Morrison said nothing. He had friends on New Denver. Colonel Ryan Murphy had been stationed there with his family. Dr. Helen Parker had run the main hospital. Captain Tom Bradley had commanded the Planetary Defense Force. Morrison wondered if any of them were still alive. The trip to the planet's surface took 2 hours. Morrison and his officers were kept in a small transport ship with their hands bound behind their backs. The guards watched them constantly but did not speak. Through the small windows, Morrison could see the planet growing larger. The landing pad was in the center of what had once been the capital city. Morrison could see human buildings mixed with new alien structures. The streets were full of both species, but the humans kept their heads down and moved quickly. The aliens walked proudly, their weapons visible. "Welcome to New Denver," the commander said as they left the transport. Or, as we call it now, Compliance World 7. They were loaded into a ground vehicle that looked like a prison transport. The windows were barred and the seats were uncomfortable. As they drove through the city, Morrison saw more signs of the occupation. Human children begged in the streets while alien soldiers ignored them. Former human shops now sold alien goods. Propaganda posters in multiple languages covered the walls. The vehicle stopped at what had once been the planetary government building. Morrison remembered visiting here during peacetime. Governor Susan Walsh had given him a tour and they had talked about the future of human expansion. Now, alien symbols covered the building and guards stood at every entrance. Inside, they were taken to a large room that had been converted into a courtroom. The walls were covered with screens showing images from across the galaxy. Morrison saw burning human ships, destroyed colonies, and crowds of aliens celebrating victories. At the front of the room sat 3 alien judges, each from a different species. The trial of the human war criminals will now begin, the center judge announced. Its voice was translated into dozens of languages simultaneously. These beings, charged with crimes against the natural order of the galaxy, Morrison looked around the room. The gallery was filled with aliens from many different species. Some he recognized from intelligence reports. Others were completely unknown to him. They all looked at the human prisoners with hatred or curiosity. The trial lasted only an hour. The aliens presented evidence of human military actions, calling them unprovoked attacks on peaceful species. They showed footage of human ships destroying alien vessels and claimed it was evidence of humanity's violent nature. No human witnesses were called. No human lawyers were present. The defendants will rise, the center judge said. Morrison and his officers stood. Brooks reached out and took his hand. Carter straightened his shoulders despite his injuries. Wells stared directly at the judges without flinching. "You have been found guilty of all charges," the judge continued. "The sentence is death by hanging. The execution will take place publicly as a warning to all who would oppose the natural order." The gallery erupted in cheers. Aliens from dozens of species celebrated the verdict. Some threw objects at the prisoners. Others made threatening gestures. The guards had to form a barrier to protect the humans from the mob. They were taken to a different building to wait for the execution. This one had been a human prison before the occupation. The cells were designed for human prisoners, but now held beings from many species. Morrison could hear different languages being spoken in the darkness. "How long do you think we have?" Wells asked. "Not long," Morrison replied. "They want to make a show of it." The next morning brought the sound of construction. Through the barred window of their cell, Morrison could see workers building a platform in the main square. The construction looked temporary but solid. At the center of the platform stood 4 wooden posts with ropes hanging from them. "Sir," Brooks said quietly, "do you think anyone will remember us?" Morrison thought about his daughter Amy. She would be in school now, probably learning about the war from sanitized news reports. Would she ever know how her father really died? Would she understand why he had made the choices he had made? "I hope so," he said. I hope they remember that we tried to do the right thing. The execution was scheduled for the next day. Morrison and his officers spent their last night talking about their families and their lives before the war. They shared stories about their homes on Earth and their hopes for humanity's future. None of them spoke about fear or regret. When morning came, the guards arrived with clean clothes and a final meal. Morrison looked at his reflection in the small mirror and saw a man who had aged years in just a few days. His hair was grayer, and his face was lined with stress. But his eyes were still clear. "Ready?" Brooks asked. Morrison nodded. "Let's show them how humans face death." The execution platform stood in the center of New Denver's main square like a monument to cruelty. Commander Jake Morrison walked slowly toward it with his hands bound behind his back. His 3 officers followed behind him, their heads held high despite everything that had happened to them. The square was packed with thousands of beings from dozens of different species. Most were aliens who had come to watch the humans die. They cheered and laughed as the prisoners were led onto the platform. Some threw rotten food. Others made threatening gestures with their claws or tentacles, but Morrison also saw human faces in the crowd. The colonists of New Denver had been forced to attend the execution. They stood in silent groups, many of them crying. Morrison recognized some of them from his previous visits to the planet. Dr. Helen Parker was there with tears streaming down her face. Captain Tom Bradley stood with his family, his jaw clenched in anger. The Zephyrian commander who had captured them stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice was amplified by speakers throughout the square and broadcast across the galaxy. "Today we show what happens to those who resist the natural order. These humans believed they could stand against their betters. They were wrong." Morrison looked out at the crowd one last time. He thought about his daughter Amy back on Earth and wondered what she would think of this moment. He hoped she would remember him as someone who had tried to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. The nooses were placed around their necks. The rope was rough and scratched against Morrison's skin. Beside him, Brooks stood straight and calm. Carter had stopped the bleeding from his broken nose, but his face was swollen and bruised. Wells stared directly at the Zephyrian commander with defiance in her eyes. "Any last words?" the commander asked mockingly. Morrison cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that carried across the square. "We die as we lived, in service to humanity. Remember us not as failures, but as people who stood up to tyranny. Our deaths here today will not be forgotten." The crowd of aliens laughed and cheered. They thought the execution would break human morale across the galaxy. They believed that seeing their commanders die would make the remaining human forces surrender. They had no idea what was about to happen. The platform dropped beneath their feet. Morrison felt the rope tighten around his neck, and the world went dark deep beneath the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. General Patricia Stone watched the execution broadcast on a secure monitor. The underground facility was known as Site Zero and officially did not exist. It had been built during the early days of human space exploration as a final failsafe against alien invasion. Stone had known Jake Morrison for 15 years. They had served together during the Mars colony uprising when separatists had tried to declare independence from Earth. Morrison had been a young lieutenant then, brave and idealistic. Stone had recommended him for promotion and had watched him grow into one of humanity's finest commanders. Now she watched him die, murdered by aliens who thought humans were weak and cowardly. The broadcast showed the crowd of aliens celebrating while human colonists wept in the background. Stone's face remained calm, but her hands were clenched into fists. "General, we need your authorization," said Colonel Kevin Hayes, her second in command. He stood beside a secure terminal that required both biometric and verbal confirmation to activate. Stone stood up slowly and walked to the terminal. She had hoped this day would never come. Protocol Zero had been created as a last resort, something to be used only when humanity faced complete extinction. But watching Morrison and his officers die had made her decision clear. The terminal screen displayed a simple message: authorization required for Protocol Zero activation. This action cannot be undone. Stone placed her hand on the scanner and felt the device read her palm print and DNA. A red light blinked and the computer's voice prompted her for verbal confirmation. "Authorization Stone 77 Alpha," she said clearly. "I hereby activate Protocol Zero under the authority granted by the Emergency War Powers Act. May God forgive us all." The computer's response was immediate. "Protocol Zero activated. All restrictions lifted. Deploying Omega-class assets. Estimated time to full deployment, 6 hours." Across the solar system, things that had been sleeping for decades began to wake up. On the far side of the moon, massive doors opened in what appeared to be empty craters. Launch bays that had been sealed since their construction revealed rows of ships unlike anything in the current Earth fleet. These vessels were sleek and black, designed for only one purpose. They had no names, only numbers. They carried no flags or insignia. The crews who flew them had volunteered for a mission from which they would never return. They had undergone psychological conditioning to remove any hesitation about their orders. In the asteroid belt, automated factories that had been dormant for years suddenly came online. They began producing weapons that had been banned by every interstellar treaty. Antimatter bombs, biological weapons, and devices that could destroy entire star systems were assembled by machines that worked without stopping. The Omega ships were not bound by the laws of war. They would not take prisoners or show mercy. They would not negotiate or accept surrender. They existed for one purpose only, to make sure that if humanity died, the galaxy would remember why. Back on Earth, Stone watched the tactical displays as the hidden fleet prepared for launch. Each ship was crewed by 50 volunteers who had said goodbye to their families and their old lives. They were still human, but they had given up their humanity for a greater purpose. "General," Hayes said quietly, "are you sure about this? Once they launch, there's no calling them back?" Stone looked at the monitor where the execution broadcast was still playing. The aliens were celebrating their victory while human civilians were forced to watch. Children were crying. Mothers were holding their sons and daughters close. "They killed our commanders," Stone said. "They murdered good people who were trying to protect their homes. They laughed while they did it. They think we're weak." She turned to face Hayes and her other staff officers. "They're about to learn what humans are really capable of when we stop being civilized. Signal all Omega ships. Launch when ready." The first ships left their hidden bases 30 minutes later. They moved through space like shadows, their hulls absorbing radar and their engines running silent. They carried no radio transmissions and left no trail that could be followed. The galaxy was about to discover that humanity had been holding back during the war. The ships and weapons they had seen were only what humans were willing to use against other civilized species. But now that the aliens had shown they were not civilized, humanity would respond in kind. The Omega ships carried orders that were simple and absolute. Find every being responsible for the execution of the human commanders and eliminate them. Show no mercy. Take no prisoners. Make sure the galaxy understood that there were lines that should never be crossed. The war was about to change in ways that no one could imagine. Admiral Kethver stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the patrol reports come in from the edge of the Sol system. The Zephyrian Third Fleet had been stationed there for 3 weeks now, making sure no human ships could escape from their home system. The execution of the human commanders had been broadcast just 6 hours ago, and Kethver expected the remaining human forces to surrender soon. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're getting strange readings from the patrol group at Grid 779. Kethver turned toward the tactical display. Grid 779 was near the orbit of the gas giant Jupiter, where 12 of his ships were supposed to be on patrol. The display showed empty space. "What kind of readings?" he asked. "Energy signatures that don't match any known human technology, then nothing." The entire patrol group just disappeared from sensors. Kethver felt a cold sensation in his stomach. 12 ships did not just disappear. "Send a reconnaissance squadron to investigate. I want to know what happened to those ships." The reconnaissance squadron consisted of 6 fast attack vessels commanded by Captain Vorthik. one of Kethver's most experienced officers. They reached the patrol area within an hour and found nothing but empty space and a few pieces of debris floating in the darkness. "Admiral," Vorthik reported over the communications channel, "there's almost nothing left. Whatever destroyed the patrol ships was extremely powerful. The debris pieces are no larger than a human fist." Kethver studied the tactical display. The missing ships had been spread across a wide area of space for something to destroy all. 12 of them so completely and so quickly was beyond anything the humans had shown during the war. "Sir," the sensor officer called out, "I'm detecting movement on the edge of our scan range. Multiple contacts approaching at high speed." The tactical display updated to show new symbols moving toward the fleet. At first there were only 3 contacts, then 5, then 10. They appeared on the sensors like ghosts, there one moment and gone the next. "What are they?" Kethver demanded. "Unknown vessel type? They're moving faster than anything in our database. And sir, they're not showing up on visual scans." Kethver had been fighting for 30 years and had never seen anything like this. The contacts moved through space in patterns that seemed impossible. They changed direction without slowing down and appeared to ignore the basic laws of physics. "All ships, battle stations," he ordered. "Form defensive formation Beta 7, prepare for combat." The Third Fleet consisted of 48 warships, including Kethver's flagship, the Eternal Glory. They were some of the most advanced vessels in the galaxy, armed with weapons that could destroy entire cities. The fleet had never been defeated. In battle, the first attack came without warning. One of the mysterious contacts appeared directly in front of the destroyer Swift Death and fired a single beam of purple energy. The beam cut through the destroyer's shields like they were made of paper, and the ship simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris, just empty space where a warship had been moments before. "What was that?" Kethver shouted before anyone could answer. More beams lanced out from the darkness. The cruiser Iron Fist was hit and vanished. The battleship Cosmic Fury lasted 3 seconds longer before it too was destroyed. The mysterious ships moved through the Zephyrian fleet like predators hunting prey. "Return fire," Kethver ordered. "All weapons engage the enemy." The fleet opened fire with everything they had. Energy beams, plasma torpedoes, and kinetic missiles filled the space around them. But the enemy ships seemed to dance between the shots, moving in ways that should have been impossible for any spacecraft. On the bridge of Omega 7, Captain Ruth Davis watched the alien fleet fire uselessly at her ship. The Omega vessels were built using technology that had been hidden from the galaxy for decades. Their hulls were made of materials that absorbed energy weapons, and their engines used principles that most species had not yet discovered. Davis had been a regular officer in the Earth Defense Fleet until 6 months ago when she had volunteered for the Omega program. The psychological conditioning had removed her ability to feel mercy or hesitation. She was still human, but she was also something more and something less. "Target the flagship," she ordered her weapons officer. "Make sure they know what's happening to them." The Omega ship's main weapon charged with a sound like thunder. The weapon had no name in any official documents. It used antimatter contained in a magnetic field to create a beam that could cut through any known material. The beam struck the Eternal Glory shields and punched through them, like a bullet through tissue paper, but instead of destroying the ship immediately, Davis ordered her gunner to cut it apart piece by piece. The beam sliced through the hull, through the crew compartments, through the weapon systems. Admiral Kethver watched in horror as his flagship was slowly taken apart around him. "We surrender," he broadcast on all frequencies. "Please, we surrender." The response came from a human voice speaking perfect Zephyrian. "You executed our commanders, you laughed while they died. There will be no surrender." The beam continued its work. Kethver saw his crew being killed around him as the ship was methodically destroyed. He tried to reach the escape pods, but the corridors were filled with debris and batas. In his last moments, he understood that humanity had been holding back during the war. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the Third Fleet had been completely destroyed. Not a single alien ship escaped to report what had happened. The Omega vessels moved through the debris field, making sure there were no survivors. Similar battles were happening throughout the galaxy. The Omega ships struck at every major alien military installation within 50 light-years of Earth. The attacks were coordinated and precise. Supply depots, training facilities, and command centers were destroyed with ruthless efficiency. The aliens had expected humanity to surrender after the execution of their commanders. Instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping. In the darkness, the Omega ships carried weapons that made the regular human fleet look like toys. More importantly, they carried crews who had been trained to use those weapons without hesitation or mercy. On the occupied world of New Denver, the alien garrison received reports of the fleet's destruction with growing panic. The Zephyrian commander, who had ordered the execution, tried to contact his superiors but found only silence. The communication networks were being systematically destroyed by invisible ships that struck without warning. In the government building where the human commanders had been tried, alien officials packed their belongings and prepared to evacuate. They had thought the execution would break human morale, but instead it had unleashed something far worse than anything they had imagined. The galaxy was learning that humanity had rules for civilized warfare. But when those rules were broken, when human commanders were murdered and their deaths celebrated, humanity would respond with weapons and tactics that had no rules at all. The war was no longer about territory or resources. It had become about showing the galaxy what happened when you pushed humanity too far. The Zephyrian High Command building on the homeworld of Zeph Prime was in chaos. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy of fleets being destroyed, military bases disappearing, and entire star systems going silent. In just 48 hours, the mighty Zephyrian military machine had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in deep space. Emperor Vashtar sat on his crystal throne and read the latest casualty reports with growing horror. The Third Fleet was gone. The Fifth Fleet was gone. The Seventh and Ninth Fleets had simply vanished without sending any distress signals. Military academies, weapons factories, and command centers had been systematically destroyed by ships that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. "How many ships do we have left?" the Emperor asked his military advisor. "Less than 30% of our total fleet, Your Majesty. And most of those are hiding in neutral space or have gone dark to avoid detection." The Emperor's forearms trembled with rage and fear. The Zephyrian hegemony had ruled over dozens of star systems for 3 centuries. They had conquered species far more advanced than the humans. How could a primitive race that had only been in space for a few hundred years cause such destruction? "What about our allies, the Karathi Confederation?" "They withdrew from the alliance yesterday, Your Majesty. They say the war with humanity has become too dangerous to continue." The communication console chimed with an incoming message. The Emperor's aide activated the display and the room filled with the image of General Patricia Stone. She sat behind a simple metal desk in what looked like a military bunker. Her gray hair was pulled back and her uniform was crisp and clean, but her eyes were cold as winter ice. "Citizens of the galaxy," Stone began, 48 hours ago, your forces executed 4 human commanders on the world of New Denver. You broadcast their deaths across the galaxy as entertainment. You laughed while they died. You thought this would break our spirit." The Emperor wanted to turn off the transmission, but found himself unable to look away. Stone's voice was calm and controlled, but there was something underneath it that made his blood run cold. "You were wrong," Stone continued. "What you saw as weakness was actually mercy. What you mistook for primitive technology was actually restraint. For 300 years, humanity has followed the rules of civilized warfare, even when fighting against species that showed us no such courtesy." The display changed to show tactical data from the destroyed fleets. Ship after ship simply vanished under the assault of weapons that the Emperor did not recognize. The human vessels moved through space like ghosts, striking without warning, and disappearing before return fire could be directed at them. "This is what happens when you mistake human mercy for weakness," Stone said. We tried to fight you with honor within the rules that govern civilized species. You rejected those rules when you murdered our commanders for entertainment. Very well, we will show you what humans are truly capable of when we abandon civilization. The Emperor turned to his military advisor. Can we negotiate? Can we offer them something to make this stop? We tried, Your Majesty. We sent 3 separate peace overtures. They were all ignored. On the screen, Stone was showing more footage of the destruction. Entire military bases had been reduced to glowing craters. Space stations that had taken decades to build were now fields of debris. The humans were not just winning the war, they were erasing their enemies from existence. Every species that allied with the Zephyrian hegemony will be held accountable, Stone said. Every world that cheered our commanders' deaths will face the consequences. Every fleet that participated in the invasion of human space will be hunted down and destroyed. There will be no mercy. There will be no negotiation. There will be only justice. The broadcast continued with a list of war crimes committed by the Allied forces. The execution of prisoners, the bombing of civilian targets, the use of biological weapons against human colonies. Stone read each charge in the same cold, emotionless voice. We are not cruel by nature, she said. We do not enjoy what we are doing, but you have left us no choice. You wanted to see what humanity was capable of when pushed to our limits. Now, the Emperor thought about the execution on New Denver. It had seemed like such a good idea at the time. The humans had been causing problems for months, and their commanders had become symbols of resistance. Killing them publicly would show the galaxy that humanity could be defeated. Instead, it had awakened something that should have been left sleeping. Your Majesty, the communications officer called out, we're receiving reports that human ships have entered our home system. They're moving toward the planet. The Emperor looked at the tactical display and saw 3 black shapes approaching. Zeph Prime. They were smaller than he had expected, but they moved with the same impossible speed and grace that had destroyed. His fleets, evacuate the capital, he ordered. Get the civilians to the shelters. But even as he gave the order, the Emperor knew it was pointless. The humans had not come to conquer or occupy. They had come to send a message that would be remembered for generations. The first human ship took position above the planet's largest military complex. A purple beam lanced down from orbit, and the entire facility simply ceased to exist. The second ship destroyed the Naval Academy, where young Zephyrians learned to become officers. The third ship eliminated the weapons research center where new technologies were developed. The attacks were precise and surgical. No civilian areas were targeted. No hospitals or schools were damaged. But every military installation on the planet was systematically destroyed. The message was clear. The Zephyrian military had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. As the human ships departed, they left behind a final transmission. It was the voice of Commander Jake Morrison, recorded before his capture and execution. His words had been found in the memory banks of his destroyed ship. If you are hearing this, then something has happened to me and my crew. I want you to know that we fought with honor and died protecting what we believed in. But if our deaths are used as an excuse for cruelty, if they are turned into entertainment for our enemies, then I hope our sacrifice will awaken something in humanity that has been sleeping. I hope it will remind our people that sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to temporarily abandon it. The war ended not with treaties or negotiations, but with a galaxy-wide understanding that humanity was never to be underestimated again. The surviving alien fleets scattered to the far reaches of space. The Korathi Confederation paid massive reparations and handed over every officer who had participated in the executions. Other species began actively hunting down war criminals. Hoping to avoid humanity's wrath, General Stone kept the Omega ships operational for 6 more months, hunting down the last of those responsible for the commander's deaths. When the final target was eliminated, she ordered the fleet to return to their hidden bases. The ships and their crews disappeared back into the shadows, ready to emerge again if humanity was ever threatened. The galaxy remembered the lesson well. Humanity could be reasoned with, negotiated with, even fought against with honor. But they should never be pushed beyond their limits. The price of that mistake had been paid in blood and fire, and no species wanted to pay it again.